The late afternoon air in Waukesha was biting, a dry Wisconsin cold that seeped through layers of wool and denim. I adjusted the scarf around my neck and stamped my boots against the curb, trying to keep the circulation moving in my toes. It was November, not technically Christmas yet, but the town didn't care. The Christmas parade was the official signal that the holiday season had arrived. Main Street was packed. It felt like the entire population of the city had squeezed onto these few blocks. There were folding chairs lined up 3 rows deep, thermoses of hot chocolate passing between gloved hands, and children sitting on their parents' shoulders to get a better view. I was standing near the intersection of Barstow and Main, a prime spot I had claimed an hour early. My younger sister, Sarah, was next to me, holding her 5-year-old son, Leo. He was vibrating with energy, pointing at every float, every clown, every burst of candy thrown from the passing trucks. The atmosphere was heavy with relief. It was 2021 and we were finally gathering again, finally breathing the same air without fear. The marching band from the high school was passing by, the drumline rattling my ribcage with a rhythmic, festive beat. Behind them, the dancing grannies were approaching. They were a local staple, a group of older women in matching outfits, waving pom-poms with an enthusiasm that defied their age. Everyone loved them. The crowd cheered louder for them than for anyone else. I checked my watch, but the time didn't matter. The sun was dipping lower, casting long, golden shadows that stretched across the asphalt. The lights on the lamp posts were just starting to flicker on, fighting a losing battle against the fading daylight. It was perfect. It was safe. Then I heard it. At first, it was just a dissonance in the background noise, a car engine revving too high, too angry for a parade route. It didn't make sense. The streets were closed. Concrete barriers and police cars blocked every access point. I looked to my left, down the long stretch of the parade route. Confusion rippled through the crowd like a wave. People stopped clapping. Heads turned. A police officer near the intersection stepped out, raising a hand, blowing a whistle that I couldn't hear over the festive music still blaring from the loudspeakers. Then I saw the vehicle. It was a red SUV, a Ford Escape. It wasn't slowing down, it was speeding up. The vehicle smashed through the plastic barricades as if they were made of paper. It didn't swerve. It didn't brake. It barreled straight down the center of the road, right into the back of the marching band. My brain refused to process the physics of what I was seeing. A car is a heavy metal object. Human bodies are soft. The collision wasn't like the movies. There were no sparks, no cinematic crashes, just a sickening, dull thudding sound as the grille of the SUV made contact with musicians, dancers, and children. "Get back," I said. My voice sounded small, distant. Sarah froze. She was staring at the road, her eyes wide, unblinking. I grabbed her arm, digging my fingers into her coat. "Move." The SUV was closer now. It swerved slightly, zigzagging not to avoid people, but to hit more of them. It was hunting. The driver was a blur behind the windshield, a shadow of intent. I saw a trumpet player fly into the air, his instrument glinting in the twilight before he hit the pavement and didn't move. Panic detonated in the crowd. The cheering turned into a collective, guttural scream. People scrambled backward, tripping over strollers and folding chairs. The dense packing of bodies that had felt so cozy minutes ago was now a death trap. We were trapped against the brick storefronts. I shoved Sarah and Leo into the recessed doorway of an antique shop. The glass display window rattled as the red SUV roared past us, mere feet away. The wind of its passing whipped my hair across my face. I smelled the exhaust. It was thick and hot, mixing with the scent of popcorn and fear. The car didn't stop. It kept going, plowing through the dancing grannies. I watched the red taillights bob and weave further down Main Street, leaving a trail of devastation in its wake. Then silence. For a heartbeat, there was absolute ringing silence. The band had stopped playing. The drums were silent. The only sound was the idling of a distant engine and the wind whistling through the decorations. Then the wailing began. It started as a low moan and rose to a cacophony of agony. I stepped out of the doorway, my legs feeling like they were filled with lead. The street looked like a war zone. Bodies were scattered everywhere. Some were writhing in pain, others were ominously still. Instruments lay crushed on the asphalt, a tuba flattened like a tin can, a drum rolling aimlessly into the gutter. "Stay here," I told Sarah. She was clutching Leo so tight I thought she might bruise him. She didn't look at me. She buried her face in the boy's coat. I walked toward the street. I didn't want to, but instinct pulled me forward. A woman nearby was kneeling on the ground, screaming a name over and over. A man in a Santa hat was trying to perform CPR on a teenage girl, his movements frantic and uncoordinated. The air smelled different now. The metallic tang of blood was rising, cutting through the cold. I knelt beside an older woman. She was wearing one of the dancing granny's outfits. Her pompon was still strapped to her wrist. Her eyes were open, staring up at the darkening sky, but there was no light in them. I put a hand on her shoulder, I don't know why. Maybe to offer comfort, maybe to check for a pulse. She was gone. Sirens began to wail in the distance, growing louder, layering over the screams of the crowd. Blue and red lights bounced off the festive shop windows, creating a disco of horror. I stood up and looked down the street. The red SUV was gone, disappeared into the suburban labyrinth of Waukesha, but the path it had cut was permanent. Hats, shoes, scarves, and candy were strewn across the road, mingled with the victims. A police officer ran past me, his radio crackling. He looked young, terrified. He was shouting into his shoulder mic, calling for ambulances, calling for backup, his voice cracking. I retreated to the doorway. Sarah looked up at me, her face pale, tears cutting tracks through her makeup. "Is it over?" she whispered. "I think so," I said, but I knew it wasn't. The car was gone, but the event wasn't over. It was just beginning. We waited there for what felt like hours. The temperature dropped as night fully set in. The festive Christmas lights strung across the street flickered on, illuminating the carnage with a cheerful, ironic glow. Joy to the World was still playing on a loop from a speaker somewhere nearby, the upbeat melody mocking the sobbing mothers and the covered bodies. Eventually, we were ushered away by emergency responders. We walked down side streets, avoiding the main thoroughfare. The town was in lockdown. Rumors were flying, shots fired, multiple shooters, a terrorist attack. No one knew it was just one man in a Ford Escape, acting out of a malice that had no ideology, only rage. We made it to my car parked 3 blocks away. My hands were shaking so badly I couldn't get the key into the ignition. I sat there in the dark, gripping the steering wheel, breathing in the cold air of the car interior. Leo asked from the back seat, his voice small and confused, "Why did the car do that?" I looked at him in the rearview mirror. He was safe. Sarah was safe. I was safe. But the image of the red SUV, the sound of the thud, the sight of the pom-poms lying on the gray asphalt, it was burned into my retinas. I started the engine. The heater kicked on, blasting warm air that felt undeserved. We drove home in silence, the radio off, avoiding the main roads. That night, back in the safety of my living room, I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window, watching the snow begin to fall. It covered the driveway, the lawn, the world in a clean, white blanket, but I knew what lay beneath the snow on Main Street. The news was already playing the clips. They showed the red SUV speeding past the cameras. They talked about the suspect, a man with a long criminal history who had been out on bail. They talked about the victims, the young, the old, the people who had just come out for a cup of hot chocolate and a glimpse of Santa Claus. I closed the blinds. The darkness of the room felt safer than the light. Christmas was a month away, but the holiday ended for me that afternoon on the cold pavement of Waukesha. The decorations in my house felt grotesque, the tree in the corner like a colorful intruder. I survived, we survived, but every time I close my eyes, I see the red blur, I hear the music stopping, and I feel the biting cold of a November evening where the only thing that came down the street wasn't a sleigh, but a machine built of steel and hate. The year 2020 had been a long, gray tunnel of isolation, and Christmas morning was supposed to be the light at the end of it. I lived in a loft on 2nd Avenue North, right in the historic heart of Nashville. The building was old, with exposed brick walls and high timber ceilings that smelled of dust and history. It was a place I usually loved, but that morning, the silence of the city felt different. It was heavy. I woke up before dawn. The streetlights were still casting long, amber rectangles across my floorboards. I wasn't sure what had woken me. The city was usually dead quiet on Christmas morning, especially in a year where tourism had evaporated. I sat up, rubbing the sleep from my eyes, and reached for the glass of water on my nightstand. Then I heard it. It wasn't a sound I associated with the holidays. It sounded like gunfire, rapid, dry pops echoing off the brick canyons of the downtown district. I froze, the glass halfway to my mouth. I waited for sirens, for shouting, for the usual chaos of a city incident, but there was nothing, just the silence rushing back in to fill the void. I walked to the window. My unit was on the 3rd floor, giving me a clear view of the street below. 2nd Avenue was deserted. The storefronts were dark, their holiday displays looking hollow and abandoned in the pre-dawn gloom. There was a vehicle parked across the street, near the AT&T transmission building. It was a recreational vehicle, an older model, white with faded stripes. It looked out of place, parked awkwardly against the curb in a no-parking zone. It was the only car on the block. I was about to turn away, assuming the noises had come from a different street, when the voice started. It didn't sound human. It was a digitized, synthesized female voice, broadcasting from a loudspeaker mounted somewhere on that white RV. The sound was loud, distorted, bouncing off the brick facades so that it seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Evacuate now, there is a bomb. A bomb is in this vehicle and will explode." I took a step back from the window. The words didn't make sense. My brain tried to categorize it as a prank, a movie shoot, or some twisted, jagged edge of a nightmare. The voice continued, calm and rhythmic, "Evacuate now." I looked down again. A police cruiser turned the corner, rolling slowly, no lights, no sirens. The officer didn't get out. He just slowed down as he passed the RV. Then another cruiser arrived from the opposite direction. They were treating it as real. My stomach dropped. The cold morning air seeping through the window frame suddenly felt freezing. I looked around my apartment. What do you take when a machine tells you your life is about to end? My phone, my keys. I grabbed my coat from the back of the chair. The voice changed. "This area must be evacuated now. If you can hear this message, evacuate now." It was a loop, a mechanical script running on a timer. The lack of urgency in the voice was the most terrifying part. It was clinical. I pulled on my boots, my hands shaking so hard I couldn't tie the laces. I shoved the loose ends inside the boots. I grabbed my cat, distinctively heavy and sleeping on the sofa, and shoved him into his carrier. He protested with a low growl, but I didn't have time to soothe him. I went to the door, then stopped. The hallway was silent. If I went out there, was I safer? Or was the street the danger zone? The voice said the bomb was in the vehicle. The vehicle was outside. My building was brick and steel. Maybe inside was better. Decision paralysis gripped me. I stood in the center of my living room, the cat carrier heavy in my hand, listening to the dystopian announcement echoing outside. 15 minutes, the bomb will detonate in 15 minutes. The countdown broke my paralysis. I couldn't stay. I opened the door and ran down the stairs. The elevator felt like a coffin trap. I hit the lobby and pushed through the heavy security doors. The street was surreal. The police officers were moving now, knocking on doors, gesturing with flashlights. They weren't running, but their movements were sharp, tense. One of them saw me emerging from the building. "Go," he said. He didn't shout. He just pointed south, away from the RV. "Get around the corner, go to the riverfront." I turned to look at the RV one last time. It sat there, innocuous, a piece of vacation equipment turned into an altar of violence. The curtains were drawn. It looked empty. Then the audio changed again. The warning stopped. Music started playing. It was an old song. I recognized the melody instantly. "Downtown" by Petula Clark. The cheerful, upbeat strings and the bright vocals filled the street, distorted by the high volume. When you're alone and life is making you lonely, you can always go downtown. It was horrific, the juxtaposition of the happy, swinging 60s tune with the empty, gray street and the bomb threat made my skin crawl. It felt like the soundtrack to a funeral for the entire city. I ran, I clutched the cat carrier against my chest and sprinted toward Broadway. The cold air burned my lungs. I passed other residents stumbling out of their buildings, some in pajamas, some wrapping blankets around themselves. We were a ragtag parade of refugees fleeing a ghost. I made it around the corner, putting a block of buildings between me and the RV. I huddled into the alcove of a honky-tonk bar that had been closed for months. The neon signs were dead. I checked my watch. I didn't know how much time had passed since the 15-minute warning. The music was still playing faintly in the distance, bouncing off the river. Things will be great when you're downtown. I looked at the officer standing at the intersection. He looked young. He was scanning the buildings, his hand resting near his holster, though a gun would be useless against what was coming. Then the world ended. It wasn't a noise, it was a physical blow. The air pressure dropped instantly, sucking the breath out of my lungs, followed immediately by a hard, solid wall of force that hit me in the chest. I was lifted off my feet. The ground didn't just shake, it rolled like the deck of a ship in a storm. I slammed backward into the glass doors of the bar. The glass didn't break, it flexed, then shattered, raining shards down on my shoulders. I curled into a ball, covering the cat carrier, squeezing my eyes shut. The light came a split second later, a flash so bright it penetrated my eyelids, turning my vision red and white. Then came the heat. It washed over the corner, a dry, dusty wave that smelled of sulfur, pulverized concrete, and burning plastic. I lay there on the sidewalk, gasping for air. The sound had been so loud that my ears had simply shut down. I couldn't hear anything. The world was a silent movie of destruction. I looked up. A massive plume of black smoke was rising into the gray sky, darker than the clouds. It churned and twisted, carrying debris with it. Papers were fluttering down from the sky like confetti. It looked festive, perverse. I tried to stand up. My legs felt like rubber. I checked the carrier. The cat was silent, huddled in the back. I brushed glass from my coat. My hearing began to return as a high-pitched, screaming tinnitus. Through the ringing, I heard the sound of alarms. Every car alarm, every building alarm in the district had been triggered at once. It was a discordant symphony of mechanical panic. I stumbled back toward the corner, drawn by a morbid gravity. The scene on 2nd Avenue was unrecognizable. The street was gone. It was buried under feet of rubble. The beautiful old trees that lined the sidewalk were black skeletons, stripped of their bark and branches. The road's surface itself was blackened and wet. Water was pouring from the sky. The explosion had ruptured the water mains and the sprinkler systems of the buildings. It was raining on a clear day. The water mixed with the dust and ash, creating a black sludge that coated everything. The building across from where the RV had been, the one I had looked at every day for 3 years, was a ruin. The facade had been ripped away, exposing the interiors of the apartments like a dollhouse cut in half. I could see a sofa hanging precariously from a floor joist. I could see a refrigerator teetering on the edge of oblivion. The street was covered in shattered glass. It crunched under my boots as I took a step forward. It looked like ice. A police officer emerged from the smoke. He was covered in gray dust, looking like a statue that had come to life. He was stumbling, holding his head. He looked at me, his eyes wide and unfocused. He mouthed something, but I couldn't hear him over the ringing in my ears. He waved his arm, a weak, sweeping motion telling me to go back. I retreated. The smell was getting stronger now, the smell of gas. A main had ruptured. The threat of a second explosion hung in the heavy, wet air. I walked toward the river. The Cumberland River flowed silently, indifferent to the violence on its banks. I sat down on a bench, placing the carrier next to me. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out. The screen was cracked, a spiderweb of fractures obscuring the display. It was a text from my mother. "Merry Christmas. Call us when you wake up." I looked at the message and felt a laugh bubbling up in my throat, hysterical and sharp. I clamped my hand over my mouth to stop it. The sun was fully up now. It was a crisp, beautiful Christmas morning. The sky was a pale, innocent blue, but below the skyline a column of black smoke continued to rise, marking the spot where the music had stopped. I watched the smoke drift over the city. I thought about the voice, the polite, robotic voice that had given us 15 minutes, the mercy of a machine. It was a strange, twisted gift. The bomber had wanted destruction, but he hadn't wanted death, or maybe he just wanted an audience. I wrapped my coat tighter around myself. I was shivering, not from the cold, but from the shock settling into my bones. I was alive. The brick walls of my loft were likely structural dust. My possessions were gone. My history in that building was erased. But I was sitting on a bench, breathing the smoke-tainted air. I looked down at my boots. The laces were still untied, trailing on the concrete. I bent down and tied them, focusing on the simple mechanical knot. Left over right, loop, pull. It was the only thing I could control. Police sirens were converging on the city from every direction now. The silence was truly gone. The investigation would start. The questions would start. But for me, the event was already over. It ended when the song stopped. I picked up the carrier and started walking away from the smoke, walking toward the bridge, leaving the ruins of 2nd Avenue behind. I walked to the rhythm of a song playing in my head, a cheerful, haunting melody about going downtown, where the lights are bright, where everything is waiting for you. The apartment complex in Grapevine was one of those places that tried very hard to look like a resort. It had manicured hedges, a sparkling pool that was currently covered with a tarp for the winter, and fresh coats of beige paint that smelled faintly of chemicals. It was Christmas morning. The sky over Texas was a pale, washed-out blue, devoid of the snow I always associated with the holiday back east. I was standing in the kitchen, leaning against the granite island, watching Nane arrange the fruit platter. She looked tired. Her eyes were puffy, the result of weeks of family tension that had culminated in this awkward gathering. Her mother, Fatme, was in the living room, trying to keep the mood light, laughing a little too loudly at a joke her brother-in-law had made. The air in the apartment was warm, smelling of brewing coffee and the heavy, sugary scent of cinnamon rolls. But underneath the domestic comfort there was a wire pulled tight. Nane's father, Aziz, had been the subject of whispered conversations all morning. He wasn't living here anymore. The separation was messy, financial troubles were mounting, and his behavior had become erratic. "Do you think he'll actually show up?" I asked Nane, keeping my voice low. She didn't look up from the strawberries she was slicing. Her knife hit the cutting board with a rhythmic thud. "He texted Mom," she said. "He said he wants to bring presents for the kids. It's Christmas." She couldn't say no. I looked out at the living room. Nane's younger brother, Ali, was sitting on the floor, messing with a new video game controller. Her aunt and uncle were on the sofa. It was a scene of fragile normalcy. Then the doorbell rang. The conversation in the living room stopped instantly. It wasn't a natural pause, it was a collective holding of breath. Fatme smoothed her dress, her face tightening into a mask of polite resolve. She walked to the door. I stayed in the kitchen, feeling like an intruder in a private family drama. I watched through the open archway. When the door opened, the tension in the room shifted into something bizarre. Aziz was standing there, but he wasn't wearing his usual collared shirt and slacks. He was wearing a Santa Claus suit. It was a cheap, velvet-like material that hung loosely on his frame. The beard was synthetic and too white, masking the lower half of his face. He held a large red sack over one shoulder. "Merry Christmas," he said. His voice was flat. There was no festive modulation, no attempt to play the character. It was just Aziz speaking from behind a mask. "Come in, Aziz," Fatme said, stepping back. She looked relieved, perhaps thinking that the costume was a peace offering, a clumsy attempt at humor to bridge the gap. He walked into the living room. He didn't take off his boots. I noticed they were wet, leaving dark, damp prints on the light beige carpet. He dropped the red sack onto the floor near the tree. It landed with a heavy, metallic clunk that didn't sound like toys. "I have presents," he said. He looked around the room, his eyes scanning everyone. When his gaze landed on the kitchen, on me, I felt a cold prickle run down the back of my neck. His eyes were dead. There was no light in them, just a void of exhaustion and intent. "Sit down, Aziz. Would you like some coffee?" his brother-in-law asked, trying to break the strangeness of the moment. "No," Santa said. He reached into the sack. I turned back to the counter to grab my mug, feeling a sudden urge to look away, to give them privacy. Then the sound started. It wasn't a bang, it was a physical impact, a hard, concussive slap that vibrated through the floorboards. I spun around. Aziz was standing with his arm extended. The gun in his hand looked small against the oversized red sleeve of the suit. Fatme was falling. She didn't scream. She just crumbled like a puppet whose strings had been cut, colliding with the coffee table. My brain froze, the image refused to process. This was a prank, this was a sick joke. Then he fired again and again. The rhythm was methodical. He wasn't spraying bullets wildly, he was aiming. Nane screamed. It was a sound that tore through the apartment, a raw, animalistic noise of pure terror. She dropped the knife and bolted toward the living room, toward her mother. "Nane, no," I choked out, my voice failing me. Aziz turned, the synthetic beard twitched. He raised the gun toward his daughter. I didn't think. Instinct, primal and selfish, took over. I dropped to the floor behind the kitchen island. The granite countertop was the only barrier between me and the man in the red suit. Another shot, then the sound of a body hitting the floor. I scrambled on my hands and knees, my movements frantic and uncoordinated. The kitchen had a small pantry, a narrow closet filled with shelves of canned goods and pasta. I threw myself inside, pulling the door shut. The door didn't have a lock. I pressed my back against the wall, sliding down until I was wedged between a sack of rice and a case of water bottles. I pulled my knees to my chest, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps that sounded deafening in the small space. Outside, the massacre continued. I heard the heavy tread of his boots on the tile. He was moving. There were more shots, distinct, final. Then silence. The silence was worse than the noise. In the silence, my imagination filled in the blanks. I pictured the living room. I pictured Nane. I squeezed my eyes shut, tears leaking out, hot and stinging. I bit down on my knuckle to stop myself from sobbing. He knows I'm here. He saw me in the kitchen. I heard footsteps approaching the kitchen. Slow, deliberate, the squeak of wet rubber soles on the linoleum. He was right outside the pantry door. I could hear his breathing. It was heavy, ragged, filtered through the synthetic fibers of the fake beard. I stopped breathing. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I thought he must be able to hear it. I stared at the sliver of light coming from under the door, waiting for the shadow of the red boots to stop there, waiting for the door to be ripped open. He stopped. I heard the rustle of fabric, the sound of something being placed on the counter. Then a voice. "Help," he said. He wasn't talking to me. He was talking into a phone, but the tone was wrong. It wasn't a plea. It was sarcastic, mocking, or maybe it was just empty. "I am shooting people," he said. He hung up. The footsteps moved away, back toward the living room. I waited. Time lost its meaning. It could have been seconds or hours. I was shaking violently, the adrenaline turning into a cold shock that numbed my extremities. Then one final shot. The sound was different this time, muffled. Then nothing. I stayed in the pantry. I didn't move. I stared at the label on a can of tomato soup, memorizing the font, the shade of red, anything to keep my mind from fracturing. The sirens came later, first a distant wail, then a growing chorus that surrounded the building. I heard shouting outside, heavy footsteps on the stairs, the sound of the front door being kicked in. "Police, show me your hands." Clear left. "Oh God, we have multiple victims." "Check the back." The voices were professional, clipped, but I could hear the tremor in them. They were seeing what I was hiding from. The pantry door opened. Light flooded in, blinding me. I flinched, curling tighter into a ball, raising my hands to cover my head. "We have a survivor," a voice shouted, "in the pantry." A hand touched my shoulder. It was firm, gloved. "Son, you're okay. Let me see your hands." I looked up. A police officer was kneeling in front of me. He looked young, his face pale. He was blocking my view of the kitchen, blocking my view of the living room. "Is this he?" My voice was a broken croak. "The suspect is down," the officer said. "Come on, keep your eyes on me. Don't look around, just look at me." He helped me stand. My legs were useless, like water. He practically carried me out of the kitchen. "Don't look," he ordered again, his voice sharp. But I couldn't help it. As we passed the archway, my eyes darted to the side. I saw the tree. The lights were still twinkling, flashing from red to green to gold. I saw the presents, wrapped in shiny foil, untouched, and I saw the red suit, a heap of velvet on the floor, indistinguishable from the blood that soaked the beige carpet. The Santa Claus mask had fallen off, revealing the face of a man who had decided that if he couldn't have his family, no one would. I saw Nane's hand. It was reaching out, as if she were trying to crawl away. The officer pushed my head down, forcing me to look at his tactical vest. "Keep moving," he said. We walked out into the crisp, cold air of the breezeway. The sun was shining. Neighbors were standing on their balconies, holding coffee mugs, staring at us with morbid curiosity. They didn't know yet, they just saw the police cars. I sat on the bumper of an ambulance, a gray wool blanket wrapped around my shoulders. A paramedic was asking me questions, checking my vitals, but I was drifting. I looked up at the window of the apartment. The curtains were drawn, but I knew what was behind them. I knew that Christmas was over. I knew that the man in the red suit had brought his gift, and he had delivered it to everyone. I closed my eyes, and in the darkness I could still hear the heavy, wet squeak of boots on the kitchen floor, searching for one last life to extinguish. I was the only one he missed, and I knew, with a terrible certainty, that I would be hearing those footsteps for the rest of my life. The winter of 2010 in Bristol was not festive, it was a siege. The frost had settled over the city like a layer of cast iron, turning the steep streets of Clifton into treacherous slides of black ice and compacted snow. I lived in the garden apartment of 44 Cannonge Road, a sprawling Victorian mansion that had been carved up into separate flats. It was a beautiful building, the kind with high ceilings and sash windows that rattled in the wind, but that December it felt like a tomb. I remember the Friday well. It was the 17th of December. The cold was biting, the kind that seeps through the soles of your boots and settles in your bones. I was coming home from work, navigating the icy pavement, when I saw her, Joanna. She lived in the basement flat with her boyfriend, Greg. We weren't close friends, just neighbors who exchanged polite nods in the hallway or discussed the recycling bins, but she was impossible to dislike. She had a brightness to her, a sharp, blonde vitality that stood in stark contrast to the gray stone of our building. She was walking ahead of me carrying a Tesco bag. I knew the contents because we had joked about it once in the foyer, the Friday night ritual of a frozen pizza and cider. She was wearing a light-colored coat, her breath clouding in the freezing air. I almost called out to her to ask if she was ready for Christmas, but I was tired, and the cold made conversation feel like a physical effort. I watched her turn into the driveway and disappear down the side path that led to her front door. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. I entered the main house and shook the snow off my coat. The building was quiet, it always was. The walls were thick, built in an era when privacy was masonry, but the internal conversions were cheaper. If you listened closely, you could hear the muffled sounds of lives stacking on top of each other, a television murmuring on the second floor, the creak of floorboards from the landlord's penthouse. I spent that evening alone, wrapped in a blanket, reading. I remember hearing a door slam sometime later in the evening. It wasn't unusual. People came and went. But in hindsight, every sound from that night has been replayed in my mind, amplified and analyzed for a sinister meaning that I missed at the time. The weekend passed in a blur of snow and silence. Then came the Sunday evening when the police knocked on my door. It wasn't a casual inquiry. The officer looked grave, his face flushed from the cold. He asked if I had seen Joanna. He told me Greg had come home to find the flat empty. Her keys were there, her phone was there. The pizza she had bought was still on the kitchen counter, unwrapped. A cold knot formed in my stomach. People don't just vanish, not without their phone, not without their coat in this weather. The next few days turned our quiet street into a circus. Police tape cordoned off the driveway. Forensics teams in white suits moved through the snow like ghosts, their breath visible in the searchlights. The media descended, parking their satellite trucks along the road, their cameras pointed at our windows, hungry for a tragedy. We were all suspects. That is the reality of a murder investigation that no one tells you about. The police were polite, but their eyes were hard. They asked about my movements. They asked about my relationship with Joanna. They asked about the other tenants. The focus shifted quickly to the landlord, a retired teacher with eccentric hair and a manner that the tabloids decided was strange enough to be guilty. I watched from my window as they led him away. I saw the way the reporters shouted questions at him, already convicting him in the headlines. It felt wrong. He was odd, yes, but he had always been kind to me. But there was someone else. Living in the flat next to Joanna's was a Dutch engineer named Vincent. He was tall, intelligent, and aggressively normal. He had a girlfriend he adored. He had a good job. During the chaos of that week, while the landlord was being vilified in the press, Vincent was helpful. I remember meeting him in the communal hallway a few days before Christmas. The air in the house was heavy with tension. "Terrible business," he said. His voice was calm, measured. He adjusted his glasses. "I hope they find her soon." "Me too," I said. "It's the not knowing, that's the worst part." He nodded, looking down at his shoes. "Yes, the uncertainty. It must be very hard for Greg." He seemed so composed, too composed. We were standing 10 feet from where a woman had likely been snatched from her life, and he was discussing it with the detached empathy of a man reading a newspaper. At the time, I thought he was just being strong. I thought he was just a rational man trying to navigate an irrational situation. Christmas Eve arrived and the snow fell harder. The city was paralyzed. The search for Joanna continued, but hope was freezing over along with the ground. The police had searched the river, the gorge, the downs, nothing. I decided to stay in Bristol for Christmas. I couldn't bring myself to leave the building. It felt like abandoning a sinking ship. I sat in my flat, the heating cranked up, staring at the Christmas tree I hadn't bothered to decorate properly. The lights twinkled, reflecting in the dark window pane, but they offered no cheer. Christmas morning broke with a sky the color of bruised iron. The world was white and silent. I made coffee and stood by the window, watching a patrol car drive slowly past. Then the news broke. It didn't come with a siren, it came through the television. A body had been found. A couple walking their dogs on Longwood Lane, a desolate stretch of road near the quarry, had seen something in the snow. A hand. I sat down on the sofa, the coffee cup warm in my hands, but my blood ran cold. Phelan, it was only 3 miles away. The reporter on the screen was struggling to maintain professional detachment. She spoke of a frozen body, fully clothed, missing a sock. She spoke of the tragedy of a Christmas discovery. I knew it was her, we all did. The confirmation came hours later, but the certainty was instant. Joanna Yeats, found on Christmas Day, discarded in a snowy verge like trash. The atmosphere in the house shifted from anxiety to a suffocating dread. The killer wasn't some random stranger who had snatched her from the street. The pizza on the counter proved she had made it home. She had been inside. She had been safe. And then she wasn't. The police presence intensified. The questions became more specific. They weren't just asking what we saw, they were asking what we heard. A scream, a thud, a struggle. I thought back to that Friday night, the silence, the thick walls. I had been sitting there reading a book, drinking tea, while just beneath my floorboards a violent struggle had taken place. I had felt safe. I had felt the comfort of the heavy Victorian door and the lock, but the danger hadn't been outside, it had been inside. The investigation turned its gaze away from the landlord and toward the quiet engineer. Evidence had been found, DNA, the science of truth cutting through the noise of speculation. Vincent Tabak. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I thought of the conversation in the hallway. I thought of his calm face, his polite nod. He had strangled her. He had panicked. He had put her body in the trunk of his car. And then he had gone shopping. The details that emerged later were the stuff of nightmares. After killing her, he had gone to Asda to buy beer and potato chips. He had spent the evening with his girlfriend. He had attended parties. He had lived among us, a wolf in a cardigan, watching the police search for the woman he had murdered. He had watched the landlord be arrested. He had watched Greg weep on national television, and he had said nothing. I remember seeing him leave the building with the police, not in handcuffs at first, just assisting with inquiries. He didn't look back. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a man who had made a calculation and lost. The days following Christmas were a blur of grief and disbelief. The flowers started piling up on the pavement outside Canninge Road, bouquets wrapped in cellophane, teddy bears damp with snow, handwritten notes from strangers. It became a shrine. I walked past the spot where I had seen her that last Friday. I looked at the pavement where she had walked, the ghost of her footsteps hidden beneath the new snow. I thought about the pizza. It was such a mundane detail, so heartbreakingly normal. She had just wanted dinner. She had just wanted to relax after a long week. The trial revealed the rest. The missing sock was never found. The motive was a vague, sordid attempt at seduction gone wrong, followed by a brutal silence to cover a mistake. It wasn't a crime of passion, it was a crime of convenience and callousness. I moved out of 44 Canninge Road a few months later. I couldn't stay. The building was beautiful, but the air inside was tainted. Every time I walked down the hallway, I saw the ghost of the police tape. Every time I heard a floorboard creak, I wondered what was being hidden. I still think about that Christmas morning. While families were unwrapping gifts and turkeys were roasting in ovens across the city, Joanna was lying in the freezing mud of a country lane, waiting to be found. And her killer was sitting in a warm room, perhaps raising a glass to the season, thinking he had gotten away with it. We like to think that monsters look like monsters. We want them to be wild-eyed landlords or shadowy figures in alleyways. But sometimes, the monster is the polite young man next door who holds the door open for you, asks about your holiday plans, and then goes back to his flat to wash the blood off his hands. I survived that winter. I moved on, but I never look at snow the same way again. I don't see purity or peace. I see concealment. I see the white sheet pulled over a tragedy, waiting for the thaw to reveal what lies beneath. And every Christmas, when the first frost hits the window pane, I check the lock on my door. Not because I'm afraid of who is outside, but because I know that sometimes the worst things are already inside with you. The alarm didn't sound like a tragedy. It sounded like work. It was just past 5:30 in the morning on Christmas Eve, and the coffee in the break room of the West Webster firehouse was still brewing, filling the air with that distinct, acidic smell of cheap grounds that every first responder knows. I was tired, my eyes gritty from a short sleep, but the adrenaline that kicked in when the tones dropped was a familiar friend. The dispatcher's voice was calm, professional. Structure fire, 191 Lake Road, report of a car and house fully involved. I pulled on my turnout gear, the heavy, fire-resistant pants and jacket feeling like a second skin. It was muscle memory. Boots, suspenders, helmet. There was a low murmur of conversation among us, not fearful, just focused. We were volunteers, but we took the job seriously. A fire on Christmas Eve was bad luck, a disruption to the holiday, but it was what we signed up for. We were thinking about property damage, about frozen hydrants, about the biting wind coming off Lake Ontario. We weren't thinking about war. I climbed into the cab of the engine. Mike was driving. He was a veteran, a guy who knew these streets better than he knew the lines on his own palms. Thomas was in the back. He was young, eager, still had that shine of someone who believed the job was purely about helping people. The ride to Lake Road was short. The darkness outside the windows was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic flashing of our emergency lights painting the suburban lawns in strobes of red and white. As we turned onto the spit of land that jutted out into the lake, I saw the glow. It wasn't just a house fire, it was an inferno. The orange column of flame was rising hundreds of feet into the air, twisting in the wind like a living thing. It was too big, too fast. My gut tightened. Fires don't usually consume a structure that completely before someone calls 911. It looked like the house had been doused in accelerant. We rolled up to the scene. The heat radiated through the glass of the truck. The house was gone, just a skeleton of timber wrapped in fire, and the flames were already licking at the neighboring car. "Lay a line," Mike said, standard command. "Get water on the fire, protect the exposures." I opened the door and stepped down onto the asphalt. The cold air hit my face, immediately warring with the intense radiant heat from the blaze. I grabbed the hose from the side of the truck. Then the windshield exploded. It wasn't a rock, it wasn't a popping timber from the house. It was a spiderweb of cracks that instantly obscured the driver's side, accompanied by a sound I couldn't place. A sharp, high-pitched crack. I froze for a fraction of a second, my brain trying to force the square peg of the situation into the round hole of my training. Firefighters deal with collapsing roofs, backdrafts, flashovers. We don't deal with ballistics. Then I heard it again, crack, crack, crack. Dirt kicked up near my boots. A metallic ping rang out as a bullet punched through the side of the fire engine, inches from my head. "Get down," I screamed, or maybe I just thought it. I dove toward the front wheel of the engine. The realization hit me with the force of a sledgehammer. We weren't fighting a fire, we were being hunted. The shooter was elevated. He was on the berm, a raised embankment that ran along the side of the road, giving him a perfect, commanding view of the street. He had waited for us. He had lit the fire to bring us here, to this narrow trap where the only way out was the way we came in, and he had the high ground. I saw Mike. He was still in the cab or just getting out. I couldn't tell through the smoke and the shattered glass. He crumpled. It wasn't a theatrical fall. He just ceased to be a person in motion and became a still object. "Mike," I yelled. My voice was lost in the roar of the fire. I looked back. Thomas was on the ground. He wasn't moving. Panic is a cold thing. It doesn't feel like heat. It feels like ice water poured down your spine. I was pinned behind the engine, the massive rubber tire the only thing between me and the invisible rifleman on the hill. The fire was roaring to my right, so hot my turnout gear felt like it was baking onto my skin. To my left was the darkness and the shooter. I keyed my radio. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped the mic. Shots fired, multiple firefighters down, we are pinned. The dispatcher's voice came back, confused. "Repeat, engine 2, confirm shots fired." "We are being shot at," I screamed into the radio. "Send police, send everything." A bullet struck the pavement near my leg, sending fragments of asphalt into my shin. I scrambled tighter against the truck. I could hear the rounds hitting the metal body of the engine. Thud, thud, thud. It was a semi-automatic rifle, a Bushmaster. He was firing methodically. He wasn't spraying and praying, he was picking his targets. I saw movement near the back of the truck. It was one of the other guys from the second rig. He was crawling, dragging his leg. He had been hit. "Don't move," I hissed at him. "Stay behind the wheel." We were trapped in a kill zone. The fire, the very thing we had come to extinguish, was now our enemy in a different way. It was illuminating us. We were silhouetted against the flames, perfect black targets against a wall of orange. The shooter was in the dark. He could see everything. We could see nothing. I tried to assess my own body. Was I hit? I felt a dull throbbing in my shoulder, but I couldn't tell if it was a bullet or if I had slammed into the truck. I checked my gear, a hole in the heavy canvas of my coat. I touched it, warm, wet blood. I was hit. The pain hadn't arrived yet, just the shock. I pressed my hand against the wound, applying pressure. Time distorted, it stretched and warped. The fire was spreading. Without us to put water on it, the wind was driving the flames into the next house and then the next. I watched, helpless, as the neighborhood began to burn. It was a surreal nightmare. I was a firefighter, watching a conflagration consume a community, and I couldn't lift a finger to stop it because a madman was using the light of the burning homes to try and kill me. I lay on the cold asphalt, the water from the tank leaking out and mixing with the blood on the ground, freezing into a red slush. Every time I tried to peek around the tire, a round would snap past. He was watching. He was waiting for movement. "Where are the cops?" the guy next to me whispered. His face was pale, his lips blue from the cold and the shock. "They're coming," I said, but I didn't know how they could get to us. The road was a bottleneck. If a cruiser rolled up, he'd pick them off just like he picked us off. We needed armor. We needed a tank. I thought about my family. It was Christmas Eve. The presents were wrapped under the tree. My wife was probably waking up now, wondering why I hadn't called, wondering why the news was showing breaking alerts from West Webster. I imagined the phone ringing in my empty kitchen. The psychological weight of the ambush was heavier than the fear of death. It was the betrayal. We help people. That is the social contract. You call, we come, we fix it. This man had taken that contract and twisted it into a noose. He used our own altruism to lure us into a slaughterhouse. I heard sirens in the distance, a wailing chorus that sounded frustrated, holding back. They knew. They had set up a perimeter, but that didn't help us. We were 40 yards from the shooter. The fire was getting closer to the truck. The heat was becoming unbearable. The tires were starting to smoke. If the truck caught fire, we would be flushed out into the open. "We have to move," the other firefighter said. "No," I said, "you move, you die, stay low." I looked at the house across the street. The windows were blown out. The shooter could be anywhere. He could have moved. He could be flanking us. The uncertainty was paralyzing. Then a sound cut through the roar of the fire. A heavy diesel engine, not a fire truck, something deeper. I risked a glance. A Bearcat, an armored police vehicle, was backing down the road toward us. It was moving slow, using the smoke for cover. Bullets were pinging off its armored hull, sparks flying. It stopped about 10 feet from us. The back doors swung open. A SWAT officer in full tactical gear leaned out, holding a ballistic shield. "Go, go, go," he shouted. 10 feet, it might as well have been 10 miles. I grabbed the collar of the man next to me. "Move." He scrambled toward the open doors. I heard 2 rapid shots. He made it inside. My turn. I took a breath. The smoke burned my lungs. I pushed off the freezing pavement, my shoulders screaming in protest. I ran. It was the longest 3 seconds of my life. I expected the impact. I expected the lights to go out. I dove into the back of the armored carrier, landing on the metal floor. The doors slammed shut. The inside of the Bearcat smelled of sweat, gun oil, and fear. It was crowded. There were other officers, weapons drawn, scanning the small viewports. "Is that everyone?" the driver yelled. "Mike and Thomas," I gasped, pointing back at the burning street. "They're still out there." The SWAT officer looked at me. His eyes were apologetic but hard. "We can't get them yet. The fire is too hot and we're taking too much fire. We have to get you out." I slumped against the wall of the vehicle as it lurched forward, driving away from the scene. I felt a tear slide down my cheek, cutting through the soot. Leaving them behind was a violation of everything I believed in. We don't leave our brothers, but we had no choice. We were transferred to ambulances at the perimeter. The scene was chaotic. Police from every agency in the state seemed to be there. State troopers, sheriff's deputies, local PD. They were gearing up for a siege. I lay on the stretcher, staring up at the gray sky. The snow had started to fall. gentle white flakes drifting down, melting on my face. It was so peaceful, so quiet compared to the hell I had just left. I found out later who he was, William Spingler, 62 years old. He had killed his grandmother years ago, done his time, and come back to the house he lived in with his sister. He had killed her too before he set the fire. He had left a note, a manifesto. He said he wanted to do what he liked doing best, killing people. He took his own life as the police closed in, a coward's way out. I spent Christmas Day in the hospital. My shoulder was patched up, a through and through, lucky. The physical wound would heal. But the other wounds, those don't stitch up. I remember watching the news from the hospital bed. They showed the pictures of Mike and Thomas. They used words like heroes and tragedy. They showed the charred remains of the neighborhood, 7 houses destroyed. The fire truck engine too was a burnt-out husk, a tombstone made of steel. I closed my eyes and I was back there. I could smell the accelerant. I could feel the cold asphalt against my cheek. I could hear the crack of the rifle. People talk about the spirit of Christmas. They talk about peace on earth. But for me, Christmas will always be the taste of ash and the sound of a dispatch radio screaming for help that couldn't come fast enough. I survived the ambush. I survived the trap. But a part of me is still pinned behind that wheel well, waiting for the next shot, watching the world burn while the snow falls softly on the dead.